All right. Um, you folks in Florida are, I have to get back up here where my notes are. You know, when you get old and absent-minded, you need to have something written in front of you. You folks in Florida are very fortunate in that regard. I know, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Bill, but in the state of Georgia, my experience is that churches are not exempt from sales tax in Georgia. And so that means every church up there pays that 6, 7, 8%, whatever it may be. One thing, too, about the sales tax, if I were you, and again, Bill, I'm getting into your territory a little bit, so correct me if I'm wrong, I would have a file folder in the office with multiple copies of that exemption certificate. Because my experience has been every vendor of the church will want a copy of that because they have to answer to the state as well, and that helps protect them. So expect to hand out a lot of those things to your vendors. Let's talk just a minute about, by the way, if you do have questions, we're not going to be able to field a lot of them here. I wish we could. It's a lot more fun for me when you put me on, you make me be on my toes about matters. But if you do have questions, if they're really, really something that you need to talk about, as Bill says, we're going to be available afterward that we'll get with you. Or if you want to write them down, we'll get back to you and other pastors with our answers to those questions, if you want to turn those in that way. I want to talk a little bit about trustworthiness, the proper handling and wise use of church funds. I will tell you this. Church members will not give because you have good financial controls in place, but they will definitely stop giving if you don't. Okay? Let me say that again. Your members don't necessarily give because you've got good financial controls in place, but they will stop giving if you don't have them in place. So you better be where you can demonstrate that the funds are being used wisely and well. Two things, the care and the handling of the tithes and offerings. There are two reasons you want to do this. One is to fulfill what's called your fiduciary responsibility. That is, you are entrusted with something of value here, people's money, that belong to them. They've given it to you and trusted you to use it wisely. Secondly, you want to protect the innocent people who are involved in the process of handling the church's money. The ushers who collect the money, the counting committee that counts it, whoever puts it in the bank, the bookkeeper or treasurer that posts it to the church books. You need to make sure that you take care of them. Most of our people who are involved in that process would never, ever think of taking a penny of the church's money. But on occasion, it does happen. Bill will tell you that the average amount embezzled from churches is probably, what, $35,000, $40,000? Oh, excuse me, $73,000. So it does happen from time to time. I was involved with a church in another state where a congregation actually accused a pastor of embezzling money from their building fund. Turns out it was totally false, but it took a lot of time and effort to fix that problem, to get that problem mended. So you want to make sure that you've got things in place that can prove to people beyond a shadow of a doubt that nothing improper is going on, okay? How can you do that? Counting cash donations. 2 may be company, but 3 is not a crowd, and 1 is definitely trouble. Now, what do I mean by that? Do not ever leave the cash offerings in the custody of a single individual. It's not fair to that person. It's not fair to the church. Have at least, my recommendation is have at least 3 people on the counting committee. 2 is better, certainly better than 1, but you really need at least 3 on that counting committee to count that offering. You need to make sure, too, that it's not all relative. Do not have 2 brothers counting it, or a husband and a wife. Again, you want to protect the people involved. You want to protect the church. I would suggest, too, that you also rotate your counting committee periodically. That's another way that you can help protect the church and the people that are involved in the process, okay? And then make sure that you keep those offerings secure. I know of one church where the counting committee would count the offering, write out their little report, then lock the offering in a desk drawer, in an office and then lock the office and walk away. They thought everything was secure. What they didn't know was that one of the church secretaries had a key to both the office and the desk, and after they were gone, would go in and help herself to what was in there. Okay, so make sure that you keep it safe, never leave it in the custody of one person, and have at least 3 people on your counting committee. Checks and balances. Who in your church handles the cash? Who keeps the books, and who signs the checks? Typically, the pastor has authority to sign checks. He has authority to expend church funds. Sometimes it's other people on the church staff. But my recommendation to you is that these 3 functions be totally separate, and that you never have one individual that does any 2 of these functions. In other words, if you are handling the cash, that is, you're collecting and counting the offerings, then you should never keep the church's books, and you should never have authority to sign the checks. If you're keeping the books, you're the bookkeeper or the church treasurer, then you never want to touch the cash, and you never want to be able to sign a check. I know of pastors who will sign blank checks and leave them for the secretary or the treasurer to use to pay bills. That is unfair to your treasurer if you do that. You abdicate your responsibility and you put it on the shoulders of that other individual, and that's not really right in my view. Thirdly, if you do have authority to spend the church's money, then you never want to be able to record anything on the church's books. You can look at the reports. By all means, pastors, you need to be looking at those reports, but you do not have the ability to go in and change anything. And you never want to touch the cash. Okay? Pastor, if you sign checks, make sure somebody else counts and deposits those offerings. Very quickly, let's move on to the wise use of funds. Strings attached gifts. You cannot accept a gift from an individual who says, I know a person over here who's really in need and I want to help them, but I want to run my check through you. So if I give you this check, you got to promise me you're going to write one to this person over here. Cannot do that. That's a gift with strings attached, and you're not allowed by law to do that. Secondly, restricted funds or designated gifts. There's a fine distinction here between these two, but a designated gift is one that would go to a particular program or project of the church, such as a building program. The law says that if someone gives to that building program, the monies that are given to that building program cannot be used for any other purpose than for what it was given, unless the donor agrees otherwise. Sometimes finding that donor may be a problem. So you have to do what's called fund accounting. Bill can tell you about that. You got to keep these funds separate and account for every nickel that comes in and every nickel that goes out. And you've got to be able to prove that you did not spend building fund money, as an example, to repair the roof, or let's find a better example, to send the youth on a missions trip. Okay? You cannot do that. Gifts to ministers. Who gets a tax break? Now, as I understand it, Bill, you're the expert here. As I understand it, the IRS says that no 2 people can get a tax break from the same transaction. So that if you take up a love offering or a pastor appreciation offering, you give it to the pastor, if those gifts go on the church books as a donation to the church and the individual gets credit for it on the year-end statement of giving, then you must record that on the pastor's W-2 as income. Okay? Is there anything wrong with somebody walking up to the pastor with a $50 bill in their hand, shaking his hand, and leaving that $50 bill with him? No, absolutely not. Because that individual is not going to get a tax break from that transaction. Therefore, the pastor does not have to report that as income. All right? So the rule is 2 people can't get a tax break from the same transaction. Yes, sir. Yes. Oh, this is one man's opinion. We've got another man down here who may have a very different one. In my opinion, every pastor ought to get a W-2. There's several reasons why, but one very important practical reason why. You are much less likely to be audited by the IRS if you get a W-2 than if you get a 1099. Okay, question? Okay, Bill, anything you would add to that? Okay, all right, very quickly, want to mention one other thing here. As you're doing your planning, as you're doing your budgeting, as you're casting your vision for your church, I want to suggest to you that you need to decide what not to do. Decide what not to do. When you get ready to spend those offerings and those tithes that come in, decide what you're not going to do. The fact of the matter is, you can stand on the front steps of any church in this state and point in any direction and point at a need that the church could help to meet. Isn't that true? I have yet to find a church that wasn't true. The problem is the needs seem to be infinite. Our resources are not. Furthermore, church congregations are just like individuals. They have strengths and weaknesses. They do some things well, they do some things not so well. Find out what your church does well and do it with excellence. And those things that you can't do so well, leave to someone else. Okay? Your vision and your mission becomes a yardstick by which you measure everything that you do. And if it's something that moves you toward accomplishing that vision, that's where you put your resources. If it's just something that you do because you've done it for 20 years, drop it like a hot rock and move on. One last thing very quickly. Ladies Ministries funds. Ladies Ministries funds, I know, are to be kept separate from regular church funds, but I think it's important that those Ladies Ministries funds be run through the church's records. The main reason for that is the IRS does not recognize ladies' ministries. As far as the IRS is concerned, ladies' ministries doesn't exist. Sunday school class fund does not exist as far as the IRS is concerned. It's the church that has standing with the IRS. And it doesn't mean that the church uses any of those funds, but they go through the church's records so that if people give a nice offering to ladies' ministries or youth ministries or whatever, they get an appropriate tax break on it, and the IRS will accept it because they recognize the church.